All right, ready to dive into something really fascinating.
Always ready.
Today, we're going deep into the White House, but not in the way you might think.
Hmm. Sounds intriguing.
We're cracking open this document called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise, and let me tell you, it's a wild ride.
Oh, I've heard of that. It's basically a blueprint for how conservatives envision running the White House, right?
Exactly. It lays out everything a new conservative president would need to know about building their team, setting priorities, and getting stuff done. It's like a playbook for power. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah, it's like getting a peek behind the curtain of how political strategy actually works.
Okay, so picture this. A brand new conservative president, fresh off a hard-fought election victory.
They must be exhausted, but also totally exhilarated.
I know, right? They step into the Oval Office, the weight of the world on their shoulders, and they need a team they can trust to help them navigate, well, everything.
No pressure, right?
Seriously. So according to this document, where do they even begin?
Well, the very first and arguably most crucial hire they need to make is the Chief of Staff.
The Chief of Staff. Interesting. What's so special about that position?
The document calls this person first among equals, which I think captures it perfectly.
First among equals, it sounds almost like something out of Shakespeare. What makes this position so powerful?
Okay, so imagine an air traffic controller during a storm. Multiple planes in the air, things are getting hectic, and every decision has huge consequences. The Chief of Staff is kind of like that.
Oh, wow. So we're not just talking about scheduling meetings and answering phone calls. This is serious business.
Totally. They're managing the entire White House office, all the advisors, assistants, the whole operation. Plus, they have to wrangle the executive office of the president, which is all those councils and agencies advising the president.
Okay, I'm getting a headache just thinking about it. This document also mentions something about deputies. Does the Chief of Staff have people to help them manage all that?
Yeah, they do have deputies, but ultimately, the buck stops with the Chief of Staff.
I see. It's their vision, their style, that shapes how the whole White House operates.
Precisely. And it's not just managing people, it's managing the flow of information, the decision-making process. A successful Chief of Staff anticipates problems before they blow up, navigates political minefields, and basically keeps the whole ship running smoothly.
No small feat. Now, this mandate for leadership goes into a surprising amount of detail about specific roles within the White House. Let's talk about the Office of White House Counsel. What do they do? I always thought it was just the legal team.
It is the legal team, but their role is much more strategic than just giving legal advice. Think of them as legal strategists, proactively figuring out how to advance the president's agenda within the boundaries of the law.
Oh, so they're not just saying, yes, Mr. President, to whatever crazy idea pops into his head.
Right. The document actually warns against that kind of yes-man mentality. It stresses finding someone who's fiercely loyal to the president's goals, but also fiercely committed to the Constitution.
That seems like a tough balance to strike. What if the president wants something that's, maybe pushing the limits of what's legal?
That's where things get really interesting. They need to be able to say, here's what we can do, and here's how we can do it, while still staying within those legal and ethical boundaries.
All right, let's move on to the staff secretary. Now, that's a job I wouldn't want. It sounds intense.
It's definitely high pressure. Imagine being the gatekeeper of information flowing to and from the Oval Office.
Whoa, so every memo, every briefing, every decision needing a signature, all of that goes through the staff secretary.
Exactly. They're the ones who decide what lands on the president's desk and what gets, filtered out.
That sounds incredibly overwhelming. How on earth do they decide what's important enough for the president to see?
This document really emphasizes the need for someone with exceptional judgment, deep understanding of the president's priorities, and a sixth sense for anticipating their needs.
So it's not just about blindly following orders. They have to be able to think strategically and make those tough calls.
And on top of that, they need to be incredibly trustworthy. They're handling sensitive information, often confidential stuff. The president has to have complete faith in their discretion.
Now, for an office, I think everyone's at least a little curious about. The Office of Communications.
Ah, yes, the spin doctors.
Hey, now, be nice.
Just kidding. But seriously, in today's world, with social media and the 24/7 news cycle, managing the message is everything, especially for a conservative administration.
It's like they're playing 3D chess with the media, trying to control the narrative and get their message out there.
And this document actually suggests something pretty radical. reconsidering the relationship with the White House Correspondents Association.
Wait, are they talking about ditching the traditional press briefings? That seems risky.
It definitely is, but the document argues that relying solely on traditional media outlets might not be the most effective way for a conservative administration to reach their target audience.
So they might focus more on digital platforms, social media, maybe even going directly to their supporters.
That's the idea. It's about being more proactive and less reliant on what they see as a potentially hostile media environment.
All right, let's move on to the Office of Legislative Affairs, or OLA. I always think of them as the bridge between the White House and Congress.
And that bridge can be pretty shaky at times, especially when you're dealing with a divided Congress, which is more often than not these days.
Oh, for sure. So what does it take to navigate that relationship effectively? What kind of skills do those folks need?
Well, you need skilled negotiators, people who can build relationships with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle.
Ah, so they're like the diplomats of domestic policy, smoothing ruffled feathers and finding that common ground, however elusive it may be.
Exactly. And they also need to be master strategists, understanding the legislative process, the nuances of congressional rules, figuring out how to advance the president's agenda, even when faced with opposition.
Sounds like a tough job. Now, this document really hammered on the importance of personnel, even quoting the phrase, personnel is policy.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
It makes sense, though. The people the president appoints are the ones who actually implement the agenda. So let's talk about the Office of Presidential Personnel.
They're basically the HR department for the entire executive branch. They manage those high-profile positions that need Senate confirmation, but they're also responsible for filling thousands of other jobs across the government.
Oh, wow. That's a huge responsibility. And wouldn't that be tempting for a new president? I mean, if you want to stack the deck in your favor, wouldn't you just appoint all your loyal supporters, even if they aren't qualified?
It's definitely a temptation, but this document cautions against that. They argue that competence should be the main criteria for filling these positions.
So even when it comes to those politically sensitive roles, they're saying it's better to have someone who's effective, not just blindly loyal.
Precisely. Of course, loyalty matters, but it shouldn't come at the expense of confidence.
All right, but let's be honest. Politics is ultimately about power. Where does the Office of Political Affairs fit into this whole puzzle?
They're the ones thinking about the long game.
Okay, like political chess masters. Always planning 10 steps ahead.
Exactly. They're analyzing everything through a political lens.
So they're constantly asking, how will this play with voters? How will this decision impact the next election? What's the long-term strategic play?
You got it.
Okay, so we've got lawyers, gatekeepers, spin doctors, political strategists. It's starting to feel like a scene from House of Cards in here. But let's not forget about the actual work of governing. Where do the cabinet secretaries fit into all this?
That's where the Office of Cabinet Affairs comes in. They're the link between the president and the heads of all those departments, everything from defense and treasury to education and energy.
So they're making sure everyone is on the same page, coordinating those big cabinet meetings and making sure the president's agenda is actually being carried out across the government.
It sounds straightforward, but try herding 15 cabinet secretaries, each with their own priorities and agendas. It takes serious diplomatic skills.
I can only imagine, and I bet it's not always smooth sailing.
Definitely not. There can be turf wars between departments, clashes of personality, even some good old-fashioned political maneuvering.
Okay, next we have the Office of Public Liaison. What do they do?
Think of them as the bridge builders between the White House and all those different interest groups out there. Businesses, labor unions, advocacy organizations, the whole spectrum.
I imagine that takes some finesse, especially when dealing with groups that might not be natural allies of a conservative administration.
Absolutely. This document actually uses the term carrot and stick to describe their approach.
Carrot and stick. Now I'm really intrigued. Give me an example. How would that work in practice?
Let's say the president wants to pass a major infrastructure bill.
Okay, big project, lots of moving parts.
Right. So the Office of Public Liaison might offer access and influence to business groups that support the bill. That's the carrot.
Makes sense. Give them a seat at the table, make them feel like they're part of the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they might be putting pressure on environmental groups who have concerns about the bill's impact. That's the stick.
Interesting tactic. So it's all about using leverage to build support and neutralize opposition. But wouldn't that also create a lot of resentment?
It's a delicate balance, for sure. This document acknowledges that, but it also stresses the importance of being strategic.
It's all about picking your battles and prioritizing those relationships that are most crucial to the president's success.
Absolutely.
Okay, last but not least, the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. What's their role?
They're the ones connecting the White House to state, local, and tribal governments. It's making sure that federal policies are actually workable on the ground and that the White House is in touch with the needs of communities across the country.
Ah, so they're the ones reminding everyone that Washington, D.C. isn't the center of the universe.
Exactly. They need to be good listeners, able to communicate effectively, and find those win-win solutions that benefit everyone involved.
It sounds like a lot of juggling. We've covered so much ground already, and it's clear that the White House office is a fascinating but complex ecosystem.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. We still need to talk about those powerful policy councils and the roles of the Vice President and First Lady.
Oh, right. There's so much more to uncover. Welcome back, deep divers. Last time, we explored those key positions within the White House office, but as we hinted, the president's influence reaches far beyond those walls.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole other level of power and decision-making we need to explore.
Right. This document, Mandate for Leadership, spends a lot of time on these things called White House policy councils.
Ah, yes, the policy councils. They're how a president tries to wrangle that massive federal bureaucracy and get everyone rowing in the same direction.
Okay, I'm already feeling a bit overwhelmed.
It is a lot to take in.
We're talking about the National Security Council, NSC, the National Economic Council, NEC, and the Domestic Policy Council, DPC, each focused on a different piece of the puzzle, right?
Right, think of them like specialized think tanks, each one bringing together experts to tackle those really complex issues that cut across multiple government departments.
Okay, before we dive into each council, I have a question. This document mentioned a tiered interagency process. It sounded pretty intricate, almost like a bureaucratic obstacle course.
It is designed to be thorough, which I guess can sometimes make it feel like an obstacle course. But imagine you're trying to get a room full of experts from, say, the State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA to agree on a new foreign policy strategy.
Yeah, that's not going to happen over a casual coffee break.
Exactly. It's going to take a much more structured approach.
Okay, so walk me through it. How does an idea, let's say, a brilliant new approach to cybersecurity, go from a whisper in someone's ear to an actual policy that the president signs off on?
All right, picture this. Someone, maybe a junior staffer, somewhere deep in the bureaucracy, has a fantastic idea.
Okay, they're feeling inspired. Maybe they just finished reading a really good deep dive.
Exactly. So they write it up, it gets passed around, maybe refined a bit, and eventually it lands on the desk of someone at the National Security Council, the NSC.
So the NSC is like the first checkpoint. They decide if the idea is worth pursuing.
Exactly. Now, within the NSC, you've got this thing called a Policy Coordinating Committee, or PCC. It's made up of experts from all the relevant agencies. In this case, you might have folks from the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, maybe even the FBI.
So it's like a mini think tank just focused on cybersecurity.
You got it. Now, if everyone on that PCC agrees, hey, this is a great idea, let's move forward, then they can start drafting up policy recommendations and moving things along.
But what if they don't agree? I mean, it's not like everyone in Washington is going to see eye to eye on something as complex as cybersecurity.
That's where the next tier comes in the Deputies Committee.
Oh, okay, so it gets kicked up the ladder.
Right. If the PCC can't reach a consensus, it goes to this group of deputy secretaries from all the agencies involved, plus the deputy assistant to the president for national security.
So the stakes get higher, the players get more powerful.
Precisely. And if the deputies committee still can't hammer out an agreement, then it goes all the way to the top, the principals committee.
Wow, now we're talking about the big leagues. Who's on the principals committee?
This is where you get the heavy hitters. Cabinet secretaries, senior White House staff, the national security advisor.
So it's like a courtroom drama,
Yeah.
each side presenting their case, trying to persuade the ultimate decision maker, the president.
You got it. Now, even after all that, the president might still say, not good enough, go back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
But this tiered process ensures that every idea, every proposal gets a thorough vetting before it reaches the Oval Office.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about minimizing those nasty surprises and making sure the president is fully informed. All right, so let's break down these councils, starting with the NSC. They deal with national security, right? But what does that actually mean in practice?
The NSC is responsible for advising the president on a whole range of national security issues. everything from deploying troops to negotiating treaties. They have to think about terrorism, cybersecurity, nuclear proliferation, you name it.
Wow, that is a massive portfolio.
It is. And they also have to coordinate the government's response to all sorts of threats, from natural disasters to pandemics.
It's like they're constantly playing whack-a-mole with global crises.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And the National Security Advisor, who runs the NSC, has direct access to the president, so their influence is considerable.
Okay, let's move on to the NEC. They're focused on the economy, right? But again, it can't be that simple. What are we really talking about here?
The NEC is all about economic policy, both domestically and internationally. Think about things like trade deals, taxes, jobs, inflation, anything that affects the economy.
It sounds like a never-ending to-do list, especially in today's world with globalization and all those unpredictable market forces.
It definitely keeps them busy. They also have to consider things like energy policy, environmental regulations, and the impact of technology.
So it's not just about dollars and cents. It's about understanding how all these different factors intertwine and influence the economy.
Exactly. And this document emphasizes that the person leading the NEC needs to be someone who can see the big picture, but also someone who's comfortable digging into the details.
All right, last but not least, the DPC. What's their area of expertise?
The Domestic Policy Council is all about, well, domestic policy. They cover everything from education and healthcare to immigration and criminal justice. If it affects people's lives here in the U.S., and it's not directly related to national security or the economy, it's probably on their radar.
That's a huge portfolio. I mean, it touches on almost every aspect of our lives.
It does. They have to think about issues like climate change, gun control, affordable housing, even things like drug policy and voting rights.
Wow, it's like they're trying to solve all of society's problems.
They are tackling some of the most complex and challenging issues facing our country. And this document really stresses the importance of having a strong, experienced DPC director who can build consensus, work with stakeholders, and find those creative solutions that actually work in the real world.
Okay, so we've got these three powerful councils, each with their own area of focus. But sometimes those areas must overlap. I mean, immigration, for example, has national security implications, economic implications, and definitely domestic policy implications. So how do they avoid those turf wars and ensure that everyone's working together effectively?
That's where communication and collaboration come in. This document highlights the need for clear lines of authority, open communication channels, and a strong chief of staff who can step in and resolve those inevitable conflicts.
Okay, so we've got these councils, but what about other key players who shape the president's agenda? What about the vice president?
Ah, yes, the VP. Their role has really evolved over time. They're not just waiting in the wings anymore. They often serve as a close advisor, a confidant, even a policy advocate.
But I imagine their actual influence depends a lot on their relationship with the president. Some presidents really rely on their VPs, while others treat them more like a ceremonial figurehead.
True, it's a very personal dynamic. But this document suggests that a conservative president would be wise to leverage the VP's talents and experience.
So think of them as a secret weapon the president can deploy on various missions.
Exactly. They can lead special initiatives, represent the president on a world stage, even break a tie in the Senate.
Right. That tie-breaking power in the Senate can be huge, especially when you're dealing with a closely divided Congress.
Absolutely. And then there's the Office of the First Lady or First Gentleman, often seen as more ceremonial, but this document argues that it can be much more than that.
It's true. We often think of the first spouse as primarily focused on those social and ceremonial duties. But they can also be a powerful voice for the administration, advocating for specific policies or highlighting important causes.
Exactly. They have a platform and a level of public attention that other administration officials just don't have.
And history is full of examples of first ladies and first gentlemen who've really made a difference. From Eleanor Roosevelt's work on human rights, to Lady Bird Johnson's beautification efforts, to Michelle Obama's focus on health and education. They've shown that the role can be as impactful as the person who occupies it chooses to make it.
This document suggests that a conservative first lady or first gentleman could be a powerful force in promoting traditional values, supporting families, and advocating for policies that strengthen communities.
So it's not just about hosting state dinners and attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies. They can actually shape the national conversation and influence policy decisions.
They absolutely can. And remember, they're not bound by the same constraints as elected officials. They can speak more freely, challenge the status quo, and champion those causes they're passionate about.
All right, so we've explored these policy councils, the vice president, the first lady or first gentleman. It's clear that the president's influence goes far beyond the walls of the White House. But how does it all work in practice? How do all these pieces fit together in the real world of presidential politics?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's what we'll try to unpack in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at how this complex structure actually functions, how decisions are made, and how power is exercised at the highest levels of government.
I can't wait to unravel those mysteries. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've spent the last 2 episodes mapping out this intricate White House structure, from the Chief of Staff's central role to all those policy councils, the VP, even the First Lady or First Gentleman.
It's like we've been putting together this giant puzzle, piece by piece.
Exactly. But now it's time to step back and see the whole picture, how all those pieces connect and actually function in the real world.
Because it's one thing to understand the organizational chart, but it's another thing to understand how decisions actually get made, how policies are formed, how power flows through that system.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the weeds describing those offices and roles, but ultimately what we care about is how that translates into action.
Exactly. So let's try a little thought experiment.
Okay, I'm game.
Imagine a major international crisis erupts. Maybe a hostile country makes an aggressive move, or there's a sudden outbreak of some deadly new virus.
Oh, wow, that escalated quickly. So what happens next? Does everyone just panic?
Not if the system's working properly. The National Security Council would immediately kick into high gear. You'd have the National Security Advisor briefing the president, probably convening an emergency meeting of that principals committee we talked about.
Bringing together all the heads of those relevant agencies, the State Department, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, everyone.
Right, trying to assess the situation, figure out the options, formulate a response. And remember, while the NSC is laser-focused on that immediate crisis, those other councils would be spinning up as well.
The National Economic Council would be trying to calculate the economic fallout, maybe looking at sanctions or emergency aid, and the Domestic Policy Council would be thinking about the implications here at home.
Exactly. Refugee resettlement, potential impacts on trade, even public health measures if it's a pandemic. So you have all these parts of the machine working in parallel, trying to anticipate those ripple effects and come up with a coherent, coordinated response.
And all the while, that chief of staff we talked about is right in the middle of the storm, making sure everyone's talking to each other, keeping the president informed, and generally preventing things from spiraling out of control.
It's like being the conductor of an orchestra, except the music is being written in real time, and the instruments are prone to playing off-key or even going rogue.
It makes the choice of chief of staff seem even more crucial.
Oh, absolutely. A weak chief of staff in that kind of situation could be disastrous. You need someone who can handle the pressure, manage those big personalities, and keep their eye on the big picture, even when things are chaotic.
This document, Mandate for Leadership, really stresses the importance of having the right people in all those key positions.
It's not just about competence, it's about alignment with the president's vision. They argue that personnel is policy.
Which makes sense. The people the president surrounds themselves with will shape how they see the world, what advice they receive, and ultimately, the decisions they make.
Exactly. And from a conservative perspective, that means appointing people who share those conservative values and are committed to advancing a conservative agenda.
Okay, so we've spent 3 episodes now dissecting this intricate White House structure. But for our listeners, what's the takeaway? Why should they care? How does understanding all this actually help them make sense of the world?
Well, for one thing, it helps us understand that presidential decisions are rarely, if ever, made in a vacuum. There's this whole ecosystem of advisors, experts, political operatives, all influencing the process, sometimes pushing and pulling in different directions.
It's like that saying, if you like laws and sausages, you should never watch either one being made.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
But seriously, knowing this structure helps us read between the lines of the news. When you see a headline about some big decision coming out of the White House, you can start to imagine which offices were involved, what arguments were made, who won and who lost.
It's like having X-ray vision into the inner workings of government.
Exactly. And it makes those decisions feel less arbitrary, less like things just happen randomly.
Right. Because once you understand the players, the processes, the competing interests at play, it all starts to make a bit more sense.
It does. And hopefully it empowers people to engage more thoughtfully with the political process.
Well said. We've reached the end of our White House journey, and I have to admit it's been both fascinating and a little bit overwhelming.
I know what you mean. It's a complex system, but it's also a testament to the ingenuity of the American experiment.
And to the incredible dedication of the people who work tirelessly behind the scenes to keep this country running.
To those unsung heroes.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of some corner of the political universe.